You're fired! Security, get him out of my company!
Your company? Read the final page.
Oh, God.
You built a chain of influence no one approved, Malcolm. Claire Whitmore Avery's voice traveled through the glass atrium under the cold white morning light with practiced calm. Behind her, the screen read Clear Leadership, Stronger Future. I stood below the stage with nearly 300 employees watching and 6 regional centers connected by live feed. 11 years of work had been compressed into a ceremony designed to make my absence look like progress. Claire wore a pale gray suit I had once helped her choose in Charlotte. I told her trust showed itself when a room became difficult. She had smiled. She was not smiling now. You encouraged field teams to bypass executive leadership, she continued. You resisted restructuring. You placed technical judgment above strategy, and you used your relationship to this family to maintain influence beyond your title. Grant Mercer stood beside the control table, half outside the camera frame, one hand near the laptop running the broadcast. No one had asked him to surrender either device. Claire paused before delivering the line he had written for her. You were given opportunities few people entering this company at your level would ever receive. Denise Walker lowered her eyes. 2 vice presidents stared at the stage with the stillness of people who had decided silence was safer than honesty. Claire's sentence did not deny that I had done the work. It made the work sound like repayment for an invitation I should have spent my life thanking them for. The human resource director slid 4 documents across the table. Terminational acknowledgement, confidentiality agreement, equipment return certification, and relinquishment of system access. A black pen rested across the signature line. I read the pages slowly. HR had sent the draft separation package to Alicia the previous evening, as my employment agreement required. She mistook my silence for shock. Grant mistook it for defeat. Sign the acknowledgement, Claire said. We can discuss the rest privately. I left the pen untouched. Do you want the reasons you gave today to be entered into the official corporate record exactly as stated? A line formed between her brows. She had prepared for anger or denial, something that would justify Grant's warnings. A question about the record gave her nothing useful. This is not another technical argument. It is a yes or no question. Claire glanced toward the cameras. Her mother sat near the aisle. Board members watched from offices across the state. She had arranged this meeting to prove no personal bond could weaken her authority. Enter every word, she said. The security director approached. I'll need your badge, Mr. Avery. I removed it and placed it beside the unsigned papers. He explained that I would wait in the vendor review room near receiving, while HR inspected my computer bag. I looked toward Grant. His laptop was open. His phone remained in his hand. He had touched more restricted files in 4 months than most directors saw in 4 years. Yet the rules bent around him without anyone admitting they had moved. Claire called it seeing discrimination everywhere. Grant called it resistance to leadership. I removed a small brass plate from my key ring. The number 001 was stamped into its worn face. Claire recognized it. Memory flickered across her expression, then disappeared. Disable his access, she told HR. The administrator selected my profile and clicked confirm. The termination screen vanished. A red notice appeared. Action suspended. Executive authority under legal review. Every phone on the stage vibrated at once. Claire reached for hers. Grant checked his screen. Peter Sloan went pale. The main display remained on the suspended access notice, while board members' names began appearing in the virtual waiting room. I closed my hand around the brass plate and checked my watch. The board meeting begins in 4 minutes, I said. Claire looked at me without the protection of her prepared remarks. 11 years earlier, that look had meant she trusted me to find the failure no one else could see. Now she understood the failure might be standing beside her. To explain how we reached that room, I have to return to the winter when Whitmore nearly lost its first hospital network. When Claire and I still used the word we and believed it meant the same thing. 11 years earlier, Claire and I still believed the word we carried equal weight. We met in Raleigh at a healthcare technology conference neither of us wanted to attend. I was 24. working as a systems engineer for a medical equipment company, and Claire was finishing an MBA while insisting she would not walk straight into her father's office. She wanted a career with her own fingerprints on it. I respected that before I knew I would love her. She liked the way I could stare at a broken process until one contradiction revealed the failure. I liked the speed of her mind, the way she entered a room already moving toward a decision. Claire came from a white family whose name opened doors across Raleigh. But she never treated me like someone who needed access to her world. I never treated her like an heiress waiting for a title. By the time we married, I was 26 and convinced we had found something rare. Two ambitious people who did not need to make the other smaller. 2 years later, Henry Whitmore got sick. The diagnosis moved faster than expected. Within weeks, the man who carried Whitmore clinical logistics in his head could no longer come into the office. That was when we learned how much depended on one person remembering everything. Dispatch did not speak to maintenance. Temperature alerts arrived after drivers crossed state lines. Trucks returned empty, while other centers paid outside carriers to cover the same routes. Each warehouse followed different procedures, and executives saw reports cleaned before they reached the top floor. Claire called me from the hospital parking garage one evening. She did not ask me to leave my job. She only said, "I don't know what I'm looking at anymore." I resigned the following week. The board gave me the title Director of Network Systems, narrow enough to keep me from authority and broad enough to make every operational failure my problem. Claire noticed. At first, she fought it. The board said formal authority could come later once the family transition settled. We believed later was a real date. During my first winter, freezing rain closed highways across central North Carolina. 2 hospital networks were waiting on temperature-sensitive medication, and 3 trucks were trapped behind road closures. Denise Walker and I took over the dispatch room. We rebuilt routes by hand, moved inventory between warehouses, paired drivers with roads they knew, and found a cold storage facility near Fayetteville willing to remain open. Claire came downstairs carrying coffee and a legal pad. She did not pose for photographs or ask for updates she could repeat to the board. She sat beside us and called every hospital herself. She told them what had happened, what we were doing, and when we would call again. Near dawn, she fell asleep beside my desk, one hand resting on the pad. The last driver called shortly after sunrise. The medication had arrived within range. I touched Claire's shoulder. She woke, listened, then wrapped both arms around me. "We saved it," she whispered. I remember the word more clearly than the relief. We. The local news arrived that afternoon. They interviewed Claire beneath the Whitmore logo and described her as the young executive who had guided the company through a regional emergency. Denise's name never appeared. Mine did not either. In the car afterward, Claire stared through the windshield and apologized. "When things settle down, I'll fix how this company sees your work." I believed her because I had seen her in the dispatch room, hair pulled back, coffee cold, calling hospitals herself. A week later, Henry asked me to meet him in the old fleet garage. He removed a small brass plate from a display case. The number 01 was stamped across its face. It had once been fixed to Whitmore's first refrigerated truck. He placed it in my palm. "My name is on the building," he said, "but you hear the system before anyone else knows it's failing." Henry meant to change the company's structure when he recovered. He never did. His health declined and he died before the board considered the proposal. After that, Claire still said "we," but less often. Then I noticed she had begun saying "the company" whenever the sacrifice belonged to both of us, and "my company" whenever the credit did. The first time I understood that a valid badge did not always mean access. I was carrying a report that could have prevented half the fleet from losing certification. I scanned into the executive corridor, watched the light turn green, and reached for the boardroom door. A new security officer stepped between me and the handle. "I need to verify who you are, sir." My photograph, title, and clearance level were visible on the screen beside him. I pointed to the green confirmation. He studied my face, then the badge, as though one of them had to be wrong. Before he finished, Grant Mercer came down the hallway with no company identification at all. He had only recently begun advising Claire, and had not yet completed vendor onboarding. "I'm with Ms. Whitmore," he said. The officer opened the door. Claire stood near the far end of the corridor. She had seen me scan in. She had seen Grant pass without being checked. I waited for her to correct it. She glanced at the wall clock instead. "We're already late. Let's get inside." Grant was given the chair beside her. Every seat had been assigned, so I stood near the presentation screen until an assistant found another one. No one objected. Each person treated what they had seen as too small to challenge. The second door closed 2 months later, though this one looked like praise. I presented a model that reduced empty return miles and predicted compressor failures before refrigerated units lost temperature. The numbers came from 18 months of maintenance records, route delays, and fuel use. One board member leaned back and said the proposal was too technical. Another said investors needed vision, not another engineering lecture. A third wrote that my manner made the room feel questioned rather than inspired. Claire sat at the head of the table and turned the page without defending the work. Grant returned with the same model 8 weeks later. He changed the title, replaced the maintenance charts with cleaner graphics, and called it the Forward Capacity Initiative. He delivered the same argument more aggressively than I had, and the board praised him as decisive, visionary, and willing to challenge comfortable assumptions. I asked where the underlying data had come from. Grant smiled as if I had confirmed something petty about myself. Inside a company, good ideas don't belong to individuals. Claire knew I had written the original report. I watched recognition pass through her face when Grant displayed one chart whose mislabeled column I had corrected in my own draft. She said nothing. His version made her look like a CEO leading change. Mine had made her look like a CEO who had ignored it. The third door was the one that entered our marriage. Miguel had found signs that bid documents and temperature certification files were being copied outside the company. I carried the access logs to Claire's office and sat across from her desk. Grant stood behind her chair with both hands planted on the polished wood. I laid out the documents one at a time. Login records, transfer times, destination servers, and the approval path tied to his account. "Have Miguel verify these with an outside auditor," I said. "Do it before anyone changes the permissions." Claire read the first page, skimmed the second, and left the rest untouched. "The way you came in here, put papers on my desk, and started telling everyone what they need to do makes people feel threatened." My hands were resting in my lap. My voice had not risen. Grant had interrupted 3 department heads that morning and ordered one manager out of a meeting. Claire had called that command presence. I looked at him, then back at my wife. "What exactly about the way I'm sitting feels threatening?" Her eyes moved away from mine. She said I was becoming emotional. She said my concerns about Grant had become personal. She said I needed to return to the responsibilities inside my title. The question remained unanswered because answering it would have required her to examine something more uncomfortable than the files on her desk. As the only black man in Whitmore's executive ranks, I had spent years watching rules tighten around me and loosen around white men who looked like Grant. Until that afternoon, I believed Claire merely failed to notice. Sitting across from her, I understood she had noticed more than she admitted. She had simply learned that the difference worked in her favor. To understand how Grant gained enough influence to stand behind Claire's chair, I have to go back nearly 2 years, to when Whitmore first began to weaken. The failures did not come as one dramatic collapse. They arrived as contracts that were not renewed, compressors that stayed in service too long, credit requests returned with polite refusals, and experienced employees who left without making scenes. Each regional center used a slightly different process. Fuel costs climbed. Maintenance bills followed. The reports reaching Claire still looked controlled because Peter Sloan knew how to smooth a line without changing its direction. I knew the company was not stable. I also knew it was not beyond repair. PulseRoute could have corrected much of what was failing. I built the first version on my personal laptop outside company hours, using de-identified operating data Henry had authorized me in writing to study. The written carve-out kept the code, models, and future commercial product outside Whitmore's ownership. The software learned where empty miles accumulated, which refrigerated units were likely to fail, and when a delay would become a compliance problem. Claire saw an early screen one evening and called it my garage project. She meant it lightly then. At least I believed she did. 4 years later, PulseRoute was serving clients across several states and producing revenue large enough to employ its own engineering team. I tried twice to show Claire the numbers. The first time, she took a call before I reached the second page. The second time, she closed the laptop and said, "I know you're doing well." She said it with affection, but affection can be another way of not looking closely. In her mind, PulseRoute remained something I worked on after Whitmore's real business was done. When the banks refused to extend Whitmore's credit again, I proposed a limited pilot, one regional center, 90 days, independent review. Claire said the board would see it as a husband using family access to sell his own product. She did not ask what it would cost the company to ignore it. 2 weeks later, Grant was introduced as a transformation advisor. He came with clean presentations, private equity language, and the promise of new capital. He never told Claire I was unqualified. He gave her a kinder story. I represented the old Whitmore, he said, the version built on personal relationships and informal authority. Employees listened to me because I had made myself necessary. Investors would never fully trust her while her husband operated as a leader without the title. Removing me from strategy was not betrayal. It was proof that she had grown into the role. Claire repeated some of those phrases later as though she had reached them on her own. Grant was careful about that. He never pushed hard enough to feel like pressure. He offered conclusions that matched fears she already carried. He also offered her a future. If Whitmore had to sell assets, he said, the family name could survive inside a new company. Claire would have a board seat. The strongest customer relationships would move with her. He called it preserving the Whitmore legacy. What he meant was preserving the parts worth buying after everything else had been weakened. His real plan depended on 3 steps. Let Whitmore fall out of compliance. Move customer data and bid information to Cedar Peak Clinical Services. Wait for the secured lender to take control, then buy the useful assets at a discount. Claire did not know every detail, but she knew Grant was building a future that did not include me and did not protect most of the workforce. She knew the new company would rise from Whitmore's losses. She knew her seat depended on staying close to him and far from me. There were questions she could have asked. Who owned Cedar Peak? Why did Grant need access to certification files? Why were customer lists leaving the company? She asked none of them. A false story is easiest to believe when it protects something you are afraid to lose. Grant gave Claire a version of events in which she was not abandoning her husband or her employees. She was becoming the leader everyone had doubted she could be. By then, she needed that story more than she needed the truth. Evelyn Whitmore's lake house had been designed to make silence feel deliberate. The dining room faced the water through a wall of glass, and every chair seemed placed with the expectation that no one would raise a voice. Grant sat to Evelyn's right that evening, closer than any outside advisor had ever been seated. Claire sat across from him. I was near the end of the table. Dinner had barely begun when Grant described his restructuring plan as though the company's recovery were already underway. He spoke of investor confidence and projected growth built on contracts Whitmore had not secured. I waited until he finished, then asked where the revenue assumptions came from. The hospital renewals are not signed, I said. The fleet numbers ignore the maintenance backlog, and the regional forecast assumes capacity we do not have. Grant folded his napkin. That is one interpretation. It is the information in our own reports. Evelyn looked at me with the patient expression she used when correcting someone she considered useful but out of place. You have always been valuable when something breaks, Malcolm. But being able to repair a system does not mean you are the person who should represent it. No one moved. The words landed harder because she had delivered them without anger. Evelyn took a sip of water. Investors need stability. They need to see someone they recognize. She did not explain what kind of person she believed investors recognized. She did not need to. Claire lowered her eyes to her plate. I waited for her to look up, the same way I had waited outside the boardroom door. For a moment, I remembered her in the dispatch room 11 years earlier, calling hospitals until her voice went rough. "My mother is talking about corporate image," Claire said. "Do not turn it into something else." Grant reached for his glass, satisfied enough not to hide it. I did not argue. On the drive back to Raleigh, Claire talked about investor expectations. I watched the highway lights cross the windshield and thought about the word "we." It had once described labor, risk, and hope shared between us. Now it appeared only when Claire wanted me to absorb part of a failure. 3 days later, Miguel Santos came to my office after most of the building had emptied. He closed the door and set an encrypted drive on my desk. I found 3 things I cannot explain. Bid files had been copied to an external server. Temperature certification documents had been opened through Grant's credentials late at night. Peter's office had prepared a transfer of the emergency reserve into a new escrow account. Miguel had preserved the timestamps and device identifiers. I spent the night following those records. The external server led to Cedar Peak Clinical Services, a company with no active operations or public clients. Its registration passed through 2 holding companies before ending with a firm controlled by Grant's longtime business partner. The pattern became clear. Customer lists, bid histories, and contract terms were being copied so Cedar Peak could approach Whitmore's strongest accounts. Grant was also preparing to revoke the digital certificate used to validate temperature records. The medication could remain safe, but without that certificate, hospitals could reject every shipment. Finally, the reserve fund was being moved into an escrow structure tied to a company Grant could influence. He was arranging for Whitmore to fail in ways that would make its best parts easier to acquire. I brought the records to Claire the next morning and laid out each page in order. Grant stood behind her chair. Claire read the first log, skimmed the ownership chart, and stopped. She said I was interpreting ordinary restructuring through personal resentment. When I asked her to bring in an outside auditor, she called my manner threatening. Then she restricted my access to certification records and authorized Grant to review whether my continued employment was compatible with stable leadership. I left her office without taking back the copies. By then, I no longer believed another explanation would reach her. The problem was not that Claire lacked evidence. It was that accepting it would require her to admit what she had chosen not to see. The financial reports Peter sent to the board were clean enough to inspire confidence and vague enough to prevent questions. Before my access was restricted, Miguel had preserved the lender notices that fell within our authorized incident review scope. Alicia then obtained the covenant tests and secured loan history through the bank's prospective buyer data room. By 2 in the morning, Grant's plan was no longer theoretical. Whitmore had violated several terms of its loan agreement. The bank had given the company time to cure the defaults, but Peter delayed disclosure while Grant prepared another buyer. Whitmore's secured loan included a pledge of 72% of the holding company's voting shares. After formal notice and an uncured default, the debt holder could exercise the voting proxy. A fund connected to Cedar Peak intended to buy the debt at a discount and use that proxy to take control before Claire understood what she had surrendered. Grant did not need her signature on the final transfer. He only needed her to keep asking the wrong questions. I called Alicia Monroe before sunrise. She listened without interrupting while I explained the covenant breach, the conversion clause, and the link between Cedar Peak and the proposed buyer. "You understand what you're proposing?" she asked. "Not a lawsuit, not an injunction. You want to buy the leverage." "I want to keep it out of Grant's hands." "That isn't the same answer." Alicia knew me well enough to hear what I left unsaid. I wanted to protect Whitmore's employees and customers. I also wanted Claire to face the truth in a room where she could not dismiss it as resentment. Both motives were present. Pretending otherwise would not make the cleaner one more honest. We formed Ironwood Recovery Group within days. To fund it, I sold part of PulseRoute to a strategic partner that had tried to invest for nearly a year. A family investment fund that had followed PulseRoute for more than a year supplied the remaining capital under strict terms. It would receive a return, but it could not sell Whitmore's assets, close facilities, or remove me from voting control without cause. Ironwood offered $31 million for the distressed debt. The bank accepted because our plan preserved operations and provided immediate cash. If the default remained uncured at closing, Ironwood could exercise the pledged share voting proxy and control 72% of Whitmore's votes. On paper, the structure was simple. In practice, every hour mattered. Alicia kept returning to one issue. Why haven't you warned the hospitals about the certificate risk? We were sitting in her conference room with transaction documents spread across the table. I told her an external warning would reach Grant. He would accelerate the transfer, erase evidence, or persuade the bank to delay closing. We needed one more day. Once Ironwood controlled the company, I could lock every account at once. You are protecting the perfection of your plan over an operational risk, she said. I am protecting the only move that stops all of it. Even as I said it, the answer sounded too certain. I instructed Miguel to preserve the logs and create offline copies. I did not tell Denise how close the certification system was to being compromised. She knew the routes and people better than anyone, but she moved quickly when contracts were at risk. I feared one urgent call would become 10, and 10 would reach Grant before the bank closed, so I kept the circle small. That decision belonged to me. The morning Ironwood was scheduled to close, Grant moved earlier than expected. At 5:47 a.m., he revoked the digital certificate used to validate Whitmore's temperature records. Trucks already loaded at Garner received automatic rejection notices from 2 hospital networks. The medication remained within range. Nothing had spoiled. But without an accepted certificate, the data might as well not exist. The shipments could not be received, the contracts could be suspended, and hundreds of jobs depended on restoring trust within 36 hours. Miguel called while I was signing the final documents. His voice was tight. He did it. The certificate is gone. I looked at Alicia across the table. She did not say I told you so. She did not have to. I had been right about Grant's plan and wrong about the part that mattered most. I believed knowing the danger meant I controlled its timing. By 9 that morning, the transaction was complete. I signed the final authorization electronically in Alicia's office, while the brass plate marked 001 rested beneath my hand. Miguel's warning about the revoked certificate had stripped the signing of any sense of victory. Alicia reviewed the filing one last time, then sent the control notice according to the schedule required by the loan agreement. Not early enough to alert Grant. Not late enough to leave the transfer open to challenge. From this point forward, she said, everything you do will be judged as the controlling party, not the excluded husband. I slipped the brass plate back onto my key ring. It should be. That afternoon, Claire delivered the accusations exactly as planned, ordered them entered into the record, and told HR to disable my access. The system suspended the action. Every executive phone began to vibrate. For 4 minutes, the room existed between 2 versions of reality. In one, Claire was still the chief executive, removing an obstacle. In the other, every decision she had made that afternoon was already subject to a power she had not known existed. The display behind her went dark. When it returned, the slogan was gone. Elaine Foster appeared by video with the bank's restructuring officer and transaction counsel. Alicia had been seated unnoticed among the legal observers at the rear of the atrium. Elaine asked that the emergency board session be entered into the corporate record. Then she read the notice slowly. Ironwood Recovery Group had acquired Whitmore's secured debt. The uncured default had activated the pledged share voting proxy. Ironwood now controlled 72% of the company's voting rights. The control notice imposed an immediate standstill on all director-level terminations and material asset transfers until the emergency session concluded. During the restructuring period, I had been appointed interim executive chairman. Claire turned toward me. For the first time that day, her expression was not prepared. "You could not have that kind of money." She said it quietly, but the microphones carried it through the atrium. I did not list PulseRoot's clients or its valuation. I did not explain the years she had chosen not to examine. PulseRoot stopped being a garage project a long time ago. Her eyes moved toward the unsigned papers, then to the brass plate in my hand. I could see her remembering every report she had closed early, every time she had told me she trusted me instead of asking what I had built. Grant began moving toward the side exit. "Mr. Mercer," Elaine said through the screen, "you are directed to preserve all company property." He kept walking. I did not ask security to restrain him. "Disable his accounts," I told Miguel through the operations channel. "Revoke remote access. Preserve every device, server image, and activity log. Send the transfer records to Council. Nothing else leaves this system." Grant stopped when his phone locked in his hand. Peter remained beside the stage, staring at the floor. I faced the employees. Relief and fear moved through the room, along with a new respect that felt worse than their earlier silence. "All 340 jobs remain in place," I said. "No facility closes today. Claire Whitmore Avery, Grant Mercer, and Peter Sloan are suspended pending independent review. No one will be dismissed to improve a report or protect an executive. The investigation will cover financial transfers, data access, certification records, and employment decisions." Miguel appeared at the edge of the stage and asked me to step into the corridor. Denise was waiting there with a tablet in her hand. She had already seen the rejected shipment notices. "The certificate was revoked before dawn," Miguel said. "The hospital systems are holding every outbound load." Denise looked at me. She did not ask whether I knew Grant was dangerous. She asked the question that mattered. "You knew someone was inside our certification system, and you let my team start a shift without warning them. Ownership gave me the authority to answer almost anything in that building. It gave me no protection from the truth." "I thought I had more time," I said. Denise's expression did not soften. "You thought your deal had more time. The distinction landed exactly where it should have." I looked back through the glass doors. Claire still stood beneath a screen that no longer carried her message. I had taken control of the company, but the most important system inside it was already failing. "You're right," I told Denise. "I was wrong. The reversal everyone had witnessed was not the ending. It was the first moment I had to prove whether I had bought Whitmore to control it, or whether I was prepared to be accountable for it." Whitmore had 36 hours to restore the cold chain certificate before the deadline closed on us all. Without a valid certificate, the temperature data existed but carried no legal weight. The trucks could not leave. The hospitals would find another carrier. Contracts would disappear, and the people in dispatch, maintenance, and receiving would pay for decisions made far above them. Grant had made the deadline worse by moving the emergency reserve into an escrow account tied to one of his shell companies. Whitmore had enough cash for routine operations, but not enough to hire an independent validation team, deploy replacement security controls, and keep every regional center running. Alicia worked from the conference room, with transaction lawyers on one screen and bank counsel on another. Near midnight, she found the approvals. Claire had not ordered the certificate revoked. She had not personally copied customer files. But she had given Grant expanded access, approved the new escrow account, ignored my warnings, and authorized a plan to remove me from certification oversight. On the final approval page, Cedar Peak was described as a continuity partner. Claire had signed without asking what it would receive when Whitmore failed. I was in the old dispatch room reviewing rejected load notices when Alicia escorted Claire in under a temporary visitor authorization. The room had changed since the ice storm. The paper maps were gone. The coffee machine had been replaced. But the chair where she had once fallen asleep beside me was still against the wall. After Alicia stepped back into the corridor, Claire closed the door and stood there for several seconds, as if waiting for the right version of herself to speak first. "The day security stopped you outside the boardroom," she said. "I saw it. I kept my eyes on the screen. I knew your badge had cleared. I knew Grant did not have one." Her voice was quiet, stripped of the tone she used in meetings. I told myself we were late, that correcting it would make me look like a wife stepping in for her husband. I said nothing. She moved farther into the room, but did not sit. "When Grant presented your model, I recognized the numbers. I recognized the maintenance assumptions. There was even a chart I had seen in your draft." She pressed her lips together. I let them praise him because his version made the board think I had chosen the right advisor. The confession did not arrive cleanly. She stopped, started again, and looked toward the dark windows instead of at me. I did not believe you were less capable, she said. I let them treat you that way, when it made my position easier. For years, I had imagined what it would feel like to hear her admit that. I expected anger, relief, or the satisfaction of being proven right. What I felt was smaller and heavier. She had understood enough to choose differently. She simply had not chosen me. What happens now? She asked. I turned from the screen. You resign. Her face tightened, though she had known the answer before entering. You turn over every email, text, authorization related to Grant, Cedar Peak, the escrow account, and the certification system. You identify every permission you approved. You correct the statements you made about me in front of the employees. You cooperate with the independent investigation, and if the documents support civil liability, you accept it. And you? I will separate what you did from what Grant did. I will not assign his actions to you because it makes the case cleaner. She studied me. You are not going to protect me. No. The word hurt us both, but it was not cruel. I will not protect you from the truth. I will not add to the truth to hurt you more. Claire lowered her head. After a long silence, she nodded. I'll sign it tonight and submit it after I correct the record in front of the employees. She sat in the same chair where she had slept during the storm, but this time there was no crisis we could solve together. The company still had 36 hours. Teams were waiting. Lawyers needed records. Trucks sat loaded behind locked gates. Yet the marriage ended quietly, in the room where we had once believed saving Whitmore meant saving us. The technical team worked through the night and found the backup certificate had been disabled with the same administrative key Grant used on the primary system. Miguel could generate a temporary replacement, but no independent reviewer had verified it. If we installed it, the trucks could leave. The temperature data showed every shipment remained within range, and several managers argued that waiting would turn a technical problem into a business collapse. The product is safe, one regional director said. We are holding medication over paperwork. He was not entirely wrong, which made the choice harder. Approving an unverified certificate would repeat the same logic that had allowed Grant, Claire, Peter and me to excuse dangerous decisions in the name of a desired outcome. I looked through the glass at the loaded trucks lined beneath the dock lights. Each hour they remained there increased the chance that the hospitals would walk away. Hold every vehicle, I said. No one answered immediately. Nothing leaves under a certificate we cannot defend. The regional director pushed back. We could lose both contracts. Then we lose them telling the truth. I called the two hospital networks myself. I told their compliance officers the certificate had been deliberately compromised, that the medication had remained within verified temperature limits, and that Whitmore would not ask them to accept our internal assurance. We would provide the raw sensor data, maintenance records, route histories, and access logs to an independent evaluator. Until that review was complete, the trucks would remain at our facilities. One officer asked whether I understood the contracts allowed immediate termination. I do, and you are choosing to stop delivery. I am choosing not to certify something we have not independently confirmed. The room went quiet. An ethical decision offered no relief when hundreds of jobs depended on it. Denise stood near the dispatch board, studying the vehicle list. Then she asked when Whitmore had stopped keeping paper calibration records. Miguel said most centers had gone fully digital 3 years earlier. Denise shook her head. Not all of them. Before the transition, company policy required each facility to retain physical logs for 5 years. The old Fayetteville warehouse had been reduced to overflow storage, but its records room had never been fully cleared. A maintenance supervisor drove there, while Denise contacted a retired fleet administrator who remembered how the files had been organized. 4 hours later, they found boxes containing serial numbers, calibration certificates, handwritten maintenance entries, and third-party inspection reports. The paper did not prove our current system had not been compromised. It gave the independent reviewers something outside Grant's reach against which to test Miguel's recovered data. Pulse Route did the rest. We matched vehicle locations, travel times, sensor readings, maintenance history, and the paper calibration records. Variations that looked suspicious in isolation aligned once the systems were placed together. The reviewers issued emergency validation for the affected vehicles and confirmed that the shipment records were authentic. The certifying authority restored provisional acceptance with 3 hours left, subject to a full audit the following week. The trucks departed late. Both hospitals accepted the shipments. Neither canceled immediately, though one later chose not to renew after the investigation. One compliance officer later told Alicia the decision had not been based only on the recovered data. Whitmore had admitted the breach before being forced to. That mattered. Grant had also left us without enough accessible cash to stabilize operations. I pledged my remaining Pulse Route equity against a short-term facility, restored the reserve, and made payroll on time. The morning after the final shipment cleared, I stood in the dispatch room before the people who had worked beside the trucks, the servers, and the records. I bought control of this company, I told them. You kept it worth controlling. There was no applause at first. Denise gave one tired nod. That meant more. Claire returned later for a final employee meeting. She corrected 3 statements from the day she fired me. My authority had not come from marrying her. My proposals had not failed because I lacked ability. The trust field employees placed in me was not manipulation. They trusted him, she said, because he was present when we were not. She submitted her resignation and left through the main entrance. Grant's investigation moved forward through access logs, transfer records, copied bids, and the trace left by the revoked certificate. He had believed systems were easiest to control when most people did not understand them. In the end, the records he manipulated became the clearest account of what he had done. 2.5 years later, Whitmore Clinical Logistics was stable again, though stability did not resemble a clean ending. We had lost one hospital network permanently. Legal fees consumed money meant for fleet upgrades, and the customer files copied to Cedar Peak could never be made private again. I had sold most of my ownership in Pulse Route to finance the acquisition and keep Whitmore operating. For months, employees questioned whether I had rescued Whitmore or simply replaced one family authority with another. Investors asked whether a systems engineer could lead through regulatory scrutiny. Some doubts were fair. I had made a serious mistake by withholding the certificate risk, and owning 72% of the vote did not erase it. I answered questions in open meetings and stopped asking people to trust intentions they could not measure. Grant was eventually convicted on charges related to wire fraud, theft of trade secrets, and the unlawful transfer of company funds. Peter cooperated with investigators, but cooperation did not preserve his position. He lost his job, faced civil liability, and spent the proceedings explaining why every warning had seemed less important than his next bonus. Claire was not held responsible for actions Grant carried out without her knowledge. She was held responsible for the documents she signed and the authority she gave him. She lost the chief executive title, left the board, surrendered her voting rights, and settled the civil claims connected to the escrow account. Our divorce was completed without a public fight. I did not use the company or the investigation as leverage in our property settlement. She left Raleigh, and we did not try to turn what remained between us into friendship. The changes inside Whitmore were smaller than the speeches people expected, but they were visible. The old chief executive office became an operations review room. Drivers, technicians, dispatchers, and warehouse supervisors could bring problems directly to leadership. I moved into a modest office beside dispatch, close enough to hear when a route changed or a refrigeration alarm sounded. The second change involved access. Security officers no longer decided who appeared important enough to enter an executive area. The system showed each person's role and clearance, and that decision stood unless there was a documented safety concern. One afternoon, I watched a newly hired refrigeration technician scan into the executive floor to deliver a maintenance report. The officer checked the green authorization and opened the door without questioning him twice. The technician walked through without knowing why the moment mattered. I said nothing. The third change belonged to Denise. We opened the Chief Operating Officer position to an independent search and published the requirements before interviews began. Denise applied, competed against external candidates, and earned the role based on her record, not because she had defended me. On her first day, she told the leadership team that loyalty to a person was not a qualification and disagreement was not disloyalty. No one mistook the comment for ceremony. We kept the Whitmore name on the building. Henry had built something worth saving, even if those who inherited it had failed to protect all of it. The brass plate marked 01 no longer stayed on my key ring. I mounted it at the entrance to the technical training center beneath a short line. Listen before the warning becomes a failure. Late one evening, I stood near the loading yard as refrigerated trucks prepared to leave. A recently hired technician noticed my name on an internal notice listing me as controlling shareholder and executive chairman. "Did they start listening after you bought the company?" he asked. The dock doors rose behind us. I watched the first truck pull into the dark. "They started listening when they knew I could replace them," I said. "That is what we have to fix." I did not explain further. The trucks left one by one, carrying records that could be checked, decisions that could be questioned, and work that no longer depended on one person remaining invisible. Owning Whitmore gave me the power to change its rules. It did not make me more deserving of respect than I had been the day I first walked into the building. What part of Malcolm's journey stayed with you most? Share your answer and where you're watching from in the comments, and subscribe for more stories where truth changes who holds the power.